being an open observer and appreciator of the world that is, without feeling like you have to add, you know what I mean? Like, even if you don't have a kid, even if you don't make art, like, even if you don't add in that sense, to the world that is, you are adding with your attention, with your love, with your, curiosity and the connections that only you can make. The fact that we are here at all, I really feel that no matter what else you do with your life, if you are aware of that in a deep way and try to live from that, wow, I get to live, I think you're living in meaning.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids or Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids or Childfree podcast. All right, so rewind a month or two, I guess it would have been, and thanks to my algorithm, the very best thing came across my feed, and that was news about the Creation Myth podcast by Helena De Groot, who some of you perhaps have heard me talking about this podcast on my Instagram. I think I shared it by email as well. In any case, this podcast that she created for CBC Personally came across my feed. I started listening, and I got to say that I was immediately hooked. You will hear me sing my praises of this podcast even more in just a few minutes. But Helena's story is one that I know is going to be relatable to and for so many of you, because she talks about her experience of grappling with doubt and uncertainty. She is someone who was pretty clear that kids were not for her. And then a series of life circumstances really thrust this question into the forefront of her mind and her life. And everything she navigates around it just was both relatable, and even in the instances that I couldn't personally relate to her story, I just was like so much captured by and empathizing with her experience. So I was, of course, delighted when Helena said yes to joining me on the podcast. And rather than rehash everything that she talks about in the podcast, which the Creation Myth podcast, that is, which is a different kind of format, it's very much storytelling in nature. It really feels like you are listening to a book. It's beautifully done. Probably even better than listening to a book in the sense that there's like music and sound effects. I'm not probably doing it justice, but it was the first time I'd listened to a podcast of this kind before. Our podcast, of course, is a interview style podcast for the most part. And as such, you're going to get a different taste of her story. But I also wanted to make sure that we weren't just rehashing the same things that she talks about and that are shared in Creation Myth, because you really have to listen to Creation Myth for it to do the full story justice. And so I kind of wanted to pick up to an extent on where that left off, and or to dive into aspects of our story that we didn't maybe hear about in full detail in the podcast. So very excited to get into this one. I want to just tell you a little bit more about Helena, who again is a producer. She's a sound designer on many critically acclaimed prize-winning podcasts and audiobooks, such as the New Yorker favorite Paris Review podcast and New York Times selected Wild and Precious, an ode to Mary Oliver. She also talks to writers and artists for the Poetry Foundation podcast, Poetry Off the Shelf. Her latest show, Creation Myth, is an audio memoir and Tribeca official selection for CBC Personally, where she asks the mother of all questions, do I want to have kids? Hello, Helena.
Hello.
I'm so excited that you're here. And I was telling you before that I was feeling nervous. And that's not because I consider you to be like, a massively intimidating character or anything like that. But it's actually because your podcast, which we're going to talk about today on this podcast, which is kind of meta, it was so impactful for me as someone who is no longer on the fence, but who has chosen the child-free path. What you share in your podcast, which I'll get you to introduce in a moment, resonated so much. And I just have to say that I thought it was so exquisite. And it feels, for people who maybe have similar podcast listening habits of myself, I typically listen to interview style podcasts and I learn things, and sometimes the sound quality is good and sometimes it's not good, but they're all a little bit the same. They're like this podcast, which, listeners, I know you love this, but But your podcast is something different. It's like, it's storytelling. There was music. There's sort of flashback scenes to past experiences in your life. And it really felt like I was immersed in this incredible story. As you put it, it's a memoir of some big life experiences, which we'll talk about today. So I don't, without seeming over the top, I want to urge listeners to tune into this podcast we're going to talk about, because it really is so wonderful. And I finally finished listening today. I had a little bit of advanced listening privileges, and I'm a bit sad that it's done because I so thoroughly enjoyed it. So welcome.
Keltie, thank you.
Tell us who you are and tell us about this wonderful podcast I'm raving about.
Oh, wow. Okay, so a little preamble. I should have an elevator pitch by now. I do not. So this is my best attempt, okay?
All right.
So I'm Helena De Groot. I started making podcasts, or I started working in radio actually 15 years ago when I was still living in Belgium. I've since moved to the United States, and the podcasts I make are all about other people. You know, I interview poets. I make stories about national defense sometimes, somehow. Has nothing to do with poetry. As one does. You know, the civil war in Myanmar suddenly was very interesting to me. So I had to make something about that. You know, I've made an audiobook about Mary Oliver. I've made podcasts for this literary magazine, the Paris Review. Like, you know, all of the podcasts that I make have to do with what other people have either written or lived through. And that's kind of how I prefer it, because I'm a very curious person, which is also why I have this job. You know, my favorite thing in the world is getting to know other people and asking them all the questions that as a regular person you could never ask, right? Yeah. You couldn't meet someone and 20 minutes later you're asking them about, you know, grieving their mother when she died, you know. And so I think it's an incredible privilege to get to know people in a really deep way through this medium. But then I started working on this podcast, Creation Myth, which is all about my own life. As you said, it's a memoir, and it's a memoir about this process of, you know, where I try to decide, should I have a kid or not? And it was so uncomfortable to make something about me, you know? And actually, initially, my idea was, I think I don't want to have kids. I want to make sure, though, and I want to understand why. So let me go talk to people who are like further along on this path. You know, people who are older than me, who have built out really beautiful lives, you know, in all these different ways, and I'm going to learn from them. Okay, so I had traveled around the country. I talked to so many people, you know, I'd asked friends of friends, do you know people or couples, you know, who don't have kids? I had hours and hours and hours of tape. And then I started working with the CBC, the Canadian public broadcaster, and they assigned me an editor. And this editor was going through my outline, and we were just sort of talking about the shape of the podcast. And she was listening to some of the tape, and she was like, Helena, you're a good interviewer. That's not the problem. But I am actually not so interested in these other people. You know, sure, they're interesting and maybe they should have a podcast of their own. But the moments where I am most engaged are the moments where you are just talking about yourself and taking us through your story. Because you go deep, you know, and I think that that is ultimately what people connect to. So I think you should just scrap all those other stories and tell your own story. And you can tell that in conversation with people who know you really well. But like these strangers, let's not do that. And my initial reaction was like, oh, absolutely not. That's a terrible idea. You know, I am not that interesting. My life is not that exceptional. I'm just a woman who's trying to make that decision a dime a dozen, right? And I was talking with a friend about this, and I was telling him like, oh, it's just so indulgent, you know? And he said, the deeper you go, the less indulgent it will be. Because it's only when you go deep that actually you allow people to recognize themselves in what you've made, you know?
Yeah.
If you tell your own story in a sort of quick schematic way or whatever, then sure, you're like, why do I need to know about this? But when you go really deep into sort of your inner turmoil and the nuances of your struggle with this topic, you open a door for other people to step through and ask themselves these same questions, you know? And so I think she was right. I know she was right, because now that I've finished the podcast and it's out in the world, that is exactly what happened. You know, my inbox is flooded with messages from people who say, thank you so much for making this. I feel less alone. You're helping me ask questions that I've never really been able to put into words, but it's helping me either make this decision myself or reflect on the decision I made, 20 years ago or whatever, whether they have kids or they don't. And it's just been such a strange experience to feel like, oh, you can talk about yourself at length and it can be a not selfish act. It can be in a way a service to others.
Yeah.
I didn't realize. And so that's been really beautiful.
Absolutely. And I think your friend there's so much insight in what they shared. And actually just hearing that, it's a reminder for me to constantly try and go deeper with the way that I share both my own experience of having been on the fence about this decision, the things I've grappled with, and the experience in general, because I think that is where people see themselves. And I mean, a couple of funny things. First of all, you saying, well, kind of like run-of-the-mill life. On the contrary, I found your story to be very interesting and to have a lot of nuance. And I suppose for any of us, if we were to really mine those stories and experiences and relationships, we probably would find the same. But it's kind of like we have these blinders on that we can't see that for ourselves. So it's wonderful. You went deep. And of course, we get so much more in you doing so. And at the same time, I felt that your story was, yes, very compelling. And at the same time, people can identify with it because this is a struggle that so many have. And the other thing I want to point out is you say, well, it's a dime a dozen. And I want to say, is it really? And the reason why I say that, let me ask you this. When you were creating this, did you know that other people were grappling with this decision to the extent that you did or do? Did it feel like a dime a dozen, or did you feel like you were the only person struggling with this kids or child-free decision, as we call it?
I think first of all, clearly not everyone struggles with it to the degree that I
Clearly
do,
not,
right?
yeah.
Because we're not all working for 3 years on this 8-part podcast, This said, I do think that this question takes up often decades of our lives. And I think maybe more for women than for men often. Even when you know the answer, right? Even when you don't want kids, I think a lot of people wonder, am I missing out? What else am I going to do with my life then? And if you do want kids, often the question then becomes, when? Because you have to think about work and do I have the financial situation and am I with the right person and do I live in the right place, So I think even for people who are not on the fence, it can be a very complicated question that takes up a lot of brain space. And then let alone the people who don't know what they want, right? I think to me, I have a hard time thinking of a more important, more impactful decision than the decision whether you will or not have kids. Your life will change forever if you do decide to have kids. And in a way, it will it will change forever if you decide not to, right? Because then forever you are a person who doesn't have children. And I've talked to people who said, I've chosen this, I'm so happy. Then I became, whatever, I turned 60, 65, and all of my friends started becoming grandparents. And it sort of resurfaced this question with, a kind of sting in there that I was not expecting. I'd always been so happy with this choice, felt like it was the right one for me. But wow, do I feel like I'm missing out on being a grandparent, you know? And so I think that question, in a sense, maybe is never fully settled. And I think a lot of people feel that way, you know? Oh, and another thing, people have also told me that they have kids, and at some point, these kids grow up and they fly the coop, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they have to reckon with, who am I if you're not a parent? And of course, you're still a parent, right? But if that doesn't take up that much time anymore, you have to sort of redefine who you are, what gives meaning to your life. And so I've heard from a lot of those people too, that they are reckoning, or that they are wrestling with those same questions, you know? Who am I in a deep sense? What do I want? How can I be useful? How can I be fulfilled, you know? So in that sense, yes, I think a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about that question in one shape or another.
Yeah. And I agree. I think the timelines are different. I mean, people who are really in the throes of indecision feel like, okay, it's like, we got to do it now. And, you know, in particular, women, I'm 35, I'm 40. And of course we can say at a point that door will close, but I do agree that there can still be questioning and uncertainty and what if, and what comes through in the podcast. And I know from my own experiences, like that is perfectly okay. And yet those are not the stories we hear. And as you put it, and I'm paraphrasing, these may not have been your exact words, but like, I was pretty sure I didn't want children. And yet I still felt like I needed to sort of like proof that, if you will. And I'm curious why that was for you. And maybe what we'll do is I usually like to start by asking people, you know, did you always know you wanted to be child-free or stay child-free, or did you always know you wanted to be a mom? So for you, like, would you say throughout your life or from a young age, did you know that motherhood was not your path, or how did you come to questioning this, if you will?
Yeah. So when I was a little kid, I didn't think about it one way or the other. But when I imagined myself all grown up, the vision that I had for my life was I would live in a big city. I would have a cool job, didn't know which one. I would live in an apartment with a lot of plants and a cat. And on the weekend, I would go dancing in a club, you know, like that was my vision for myself. I was a little kid in the 80s. So, the club seemed like a very exciting place to be. Okay. So I didn't realize though, like, oh, there's no kid in this scenario. You know, it was just like, well, there's also no space travel in that scenario. You know, it's just like, it's not a thing I thought about. And I didn't play with dolls and, but still it didn't strike me as out of the norm or anything like that. It was only when I grew up and I turned 20, 21, I got out of college, that I was asked this question by other people, do you want to have kids? Do you have kids? That was the first question, even at that age. And then, do you want to have kids? And I would say, I don't think so, no, And again, it was not because I had reasoned this all true, It was just like, I've never had this desire, so probably not. Mm-hmm. And I got such firm pushback, from friends, from strangers. And it was, I think, in that pushback that I started really solidifying my position. And I don't like that word position because we're not in camps here. I don't like this feeling of like this is an ideology. I really don't like that. It's a deeply personal, nuanced decision. And so I think that it's because I had to defend myself for years and years that it became more of an ideology. I became, radicalized in a way. And so I saw myself more and more as like it became part of my identity. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was almost
absolutely.
like not a decision anymore, but just like a defining trait, you know? And it said something about the kind of person that I was. I wasn't sure what it said, what was exactly the message in there, but I felt like it was unchangeable. Like this is a fact, like the fact that I have brown eyes and that I like to read, this is just one of those things about me.
One question I want to ask you with that is, you talk about sort of like staunchly defending yourself and like, this is my ideology, if you will. And I think I see that quite a bit in amongst, we can even say, the child-free movement, which I don't, there's nothing inherently wrong with regarding it that way, but it does become sort of, a movement, a way of life and being, I think, because so many child-free people feel that they have to like kind of put these walls up and make a position. And also is what makes this conversation around like, what do I want? If I have doubts, is that okay? It makes it hard to have or not had at all, because we see representation of both the, I've always known I wanted to have children, this is my like life's purpose and calling, and hell no, I never wanted to have kids. And those are just a bunch of breeders over there. And like, what a stupid idea, right? We see these like very polar opposite perspectives and views. And most people, I think, live in between, but those are generally not the conversations we're having. So, okay. So outwardly though, you're like, hell no, I'm not, not having children, however you frame that. Did people's constant questioning ever shake that solid feeling for you? Like, because I know for a lot of people, it brings it into question. Like, what if they're right? Like, am I making the right choice? Or for you, did it make you feel even more affirmative in your feeling that you did not want to have kids?
When strangers asked me, that only solidified it, because I was like, who the hell are you? And what do you think you know about me? What did shake my foundations was friends pushing back. People who knew me really, really well and would say things like, but Helena, you're so good at love. You're so curious about other people. You're so giving, so warm. How could you say no to this experience that is all about that? And you love learning. And having a child is sort of one of the most intense learning opportunities, And because it was my friends, and because they could come up with arguments that felt so true to me, I ended up feeling like, what do they know that I don't? What is it that they understand that I don't? And then, of course, it was a very sort of short step to thinking, what is wrong with me? Like, why, like, am I closed off in some way? Is there a desire that I am repressing? Am I just afraid? Because I am afraid of a lot of things. I mean, I think many people are, but, for me, one of the things that I've always been afraid of is this loss of control, this feeling that I cannot decide. For instance, okay, stupid example. I don't love parties, but when I go, I soothe myself with the thought I can always leave,
Yeah.
Like, I'm not trapped here. When I have enough of this sort of overwhelming experience, fabulous, I can just turn around and go. But when you have a kid, that's not possible. You can't be like, okay, this is an interesting experience, but the rest of the night I would like to spend. Yeah, exactly. Whether that's just for a little while or forever, you can't. And so I think it was that feeling of like, once you make the decision, it's forever. That was terrifying to me. But then I started questioning that fear. And I think that's what really started shaking my foundations and turned into self-hatred, like, why am I this way? What else am I missing out on? Because, people also say things like, you only know what life is about when you have a kid. You only know what love is when you have a kid. And I know I want to know what life is about, and I want to know what love is. So the fact that so many different people kept telling me that, they couldn't all be wrong, And so inside, I was constantly being, shaken. But outside, it didn't change anything. I wasn't sharing that I had these doubts.
Yeah.
Because I felt, just like you said, I felt like I couldn't. I couldn't give rope to people who were trying to convince me.
All right, this just in, I have shared the dates and open up doors to our Kids Are Child Free group program spring session. Now, if you are a woman on the fence about kids and you want to be supported on this journey, both as far as being part of a community of women who know what it's like to be on the fence, as well as by myself, yours truly, who will act as your guide in this process of figuring out whether kids or child free is a path for you, you're going to want to check out this program. We're going to be kicking things off on April 28th, and this program will run for 3 months where I'm going to take you through a step-by-step process to help you get clear on the path that is right for you, whatever that path may be. These are so many of the same questions and exercises and process that I personally went through, as well as what I use to guide my private coaching clients. And again, you're going to do it in a small group, typically 4, 6, 8 other women to, in community, come together, have discussion, go through these exercises, get the support, and really create sort of a dedicated space in your life to tackle this question. Because if you're anything like me, when I was exploring the Kids Are Child Free decision, and if you're anything like most of my clients, this decision can really bleed over into everything, right? Your whole day, your week, your month, your nights out with your partner, whether it's going to work, any aspect of your life. You just are constantly plagued with this decision. So if you want to contain that a little bit while knowing you're actually taking some steps forward, steps that are going to allow you to come to a clear decision about whether Kids Are Child Free is for you, again, check out the Kids Are Child Free group program, which is going to be kicking off the next session on April 28th. I will include a link in the show notes of today's episode. You can also find the details at kidsarechildfree.com under the Work With Me tab. You're the first person I've heard use that term, like that you felt self-hatred. And I will say the first person besides myself. And and I only mention that because when I've often described my experience, I mean, it really was a sort of self-loathing. And what I realized at a point sort of in my journey, if you will, is that if I was casting so much judgment on myself for the way I felt or didn't feel, if I had so much shame, like that became basically like sort of a screen or a filter between me and my desires, because how could I allow myself to want something that I thought was so abhorrent and terrible? And by the way, not for other people. Like I was like, okay, other people don't want kids. That's fine for them. But like, what the hell's wrong with me? And I don't want to say that like having compassion for myself was the key to accepting and becoming, having more clarity on things, but it was actually a big part of it because like, I mean, my inner dialogue, it was kind of horrific, the things I said to myself. So it's some solace for me to hear you say the same. Yeah. It's not just me.
No,
not like
far from
irreparably screwed up.
Inner dialogue. Wow. Seriously. Yeah. I mean, it is really what you say, like it puts a screen between you and your desires, and as I said before, right, like it becomes this identity. And once you've made something your identity, it's very hard to roll it back, because then you just see proof everywhere that this is who you are. Yeah. And like we all know, like we change, sometimes because we do it ourselves and sometimes because circumstances force us, but there's no such thing as like our fixed identity. Yeah. But that is very easy to forget.
Yeah, no, totally. I'm curious, I found it interesting because in Creation Myth, you highlight, showcase some of these relationships and conversations with people. And I wouldn't say that they're like, if they're exerting pressure, it doesn't come across as like, I'm trying to, be a jerk and force your hand to like make you become a mom. But it ends up, of course, feeling really pressurous for you. And they say things that are, I think, like beautiful and loving and true about you and the kind of person you are and how you go about the world. But like, I'm curious now, of course, hindsight's 2020, but like, how do you regard them, as you say, sort of knowing something that you don't know, don't see, can't feel, having regard for you as a person? Like, how do you contend with that now as someone who has seemingly, and we'll talk more about this later, but like move more into, I guess, some confidence and acceptance with the child-free choice?
Yeah. Now that the show is out and I'm getting these reactions and responses from people, a lot of it I mean, a lot of people are extremely, like nuanced and sort of tender towards how complicated this all is.
Yeah.
And then there's another group of people who are just filled with vitriol, not towards me, but towards the people who've tried to convince me. And they're, of course, really talking about the people who've tried to convince them, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
good point.
Like, oh, why are men, like this? Like people who, they should be forced to sign a contract, say when you get married to someone and they're like, okay, I'm good with you not wanting kids. And then they change their mind and start, trying to convince you. They should be forced, like a prenup to sign a contract and then be forced to pay a lot of money when they break that contract. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of sort of
yeah,
like vindictiveness almost.
Yeah.
And I get that. And it is frustrating and painful to not be trusted by the people that supposedly know you the best,
Yeah.
But that's not how I feel. And it's not how I've ever felt. Because I know that it comes from a good place. Like, I really think that they were trying to protect me from making a mistake that, you cannot undo, like at a certain point, right? As you said, for a woman, the door is closed and then you can't undo that. And I think they were just afraid that I was imagining it wrong. You know what I mean? Especially people who had kids, they were like, look, I hear what you're saying. And of course it's exhausting and you have less time for the work projects that you're interested in or friends, but the richness that you get in return, like you can't know that when you don't have a kid. And so let me from the future tell you how incredible it is. And so I don't resent them at all for trying to convince me. Of course, that doesn't mean that I wasn't often frustrated and got angry with them.
Yeah.
But it's not the sort of the feeling that I'm left with.
Yeah. I'm glad. I think, I don't know, we generally need to believe like the goodwill of others, especially people that we love and trust, right? And understanding as much as those pressures and those questions can make us feel really terrible. And in a perfect world, maybe people just would all say, hey, I love you and whatever you choose is wonderful, which I'm sure might have also been part of that conversation. But it makes sense that we want to speak from the place which we're living in, right? And just like I might say to someone, these are the wonderful things about this child-free path I've chosen, and what about this and what about that, which, I can't do in my profession, but I possibly would otherwise. I can understand how parents, if they've had, it's like, I mean, it's a silly analogy, but I always use like, a travel analogy. I was in South Africa a few years ago. One of my favorite trips, places I've ever been. If someone so much as hints at the fact they might go to South Africa, I'm going to tell you about how wonderful it is and you must go and you can do this and you can do this. And like, there of course can be like more inquiry there. And I appreciate there may have been with your friends, but like a lot of times it's just people are like, oh my gosh, this amazing thing. And I want you to experience it too, because I love you. And I want you to see the wild animals that I saw. And I want you to meet the people and I want you to see the landscape. Without ever checking if, South Africa has anything that may entice you. And maybe, I know you want to go to South Africa, but maybe you want to go to Namibia better. I don't know.
I mean, I have a good example of that actually, where I got a taste of the other side of this, So I was talking to a woman who doesn't have kids, and her path, towards not having kids is that she never found the right partner. And she was like, I don't want to have sort of a kid at all costs and be a single mom, So for me, it was really, I'll first meet the right person and then we can, start trying to have a kid. And she never found that person. And, she tried for a long time and got disappointed in love over and over again. And so when we talked, she was in her late 40s. She said, I'm good. Like, I have a beautiful life. You know, she traveled a lot. She's a poet. You know, she's able to sort of live off of that, even though that income is not, you know, that reliable, because it's just her, you know? And she was like, I have so many friends. Like, I feel loved and I have a beautiful community. I don't need a romantic partner. And I was feeling terrible for her.
Yeah.
You know, I was like, look, I can hear that you're saying this, you know, bravely, right? Like, I'm good and I have a community and I'm loved. But I was like, but you're not, you know, like, I mean, you no, that, let me rephrase. Do you know what I mean? Like,
absolutely.
Like, of course you have a community, but
Yeah.
there is so much more out there, you know, and the love and the sort of story that you build with one person, the way it deepens your everyday, you know, like, how can you give up on that? You know, like, please keep looking. And then the moment I thought that, I was like, oh, I know what I'm doing. This is what people do with me. And so I'm so grateful that I had that experience, because it gave me an insight into what those people who are parents and want to convince me, what they feel. Indeed, it is not out of meanness or not even, because a lot of people are like, people just get nervous when you don't follow the norm. And they want to sort of put everyone in the little box that is the norm. But I don't think that this is always like that. You know, I really, like, me realizing that I was imagining her life as impoverished because she doesn't have a romantic partner. That is out of concern for her, out of love for her, you know? And so that has also helped me to not be angry or resentful, you know, with these friends who tried to convince me.
That was such a great moment in conversation in the podcast. You can hear a full recounting of that, or the experience if you tune in for a Creation Myth. And I caught myself doing something similar. And I've actually, I've recounted that story now in at least 1 or 2 coaching sessions since listening, because I think it's like a great framing to remember that when we have our own experience and we think we love it, it's wonderful, we want other people to do that, right? I love hiking. I think everybody should go explore the Alps and go to mountain peaks. And you know, what I try and remember is, like, yes, it's amazing and wonderful. A, it's not going to be for everyone, and B, there are other wonderful life experiences we can have, and we can't do it all. And like, where we get, I think, really mixed up is where we assign values, where we say one is greater than the other. And also, you know, frankly, I'm kind of like, okay, maybe it is greater, but as long as I feel good with what I have, I almost don't care. It's like, if I know love, is there like this epitome of love that's beyond the love I know? Maybe, but I don't feel bad about the love I have. Like,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about your marriage, your first marriage. We won't get like too much into the ins and outs, only because it's like you outline in detail this experience and the ups and downs so beautifully in the podcast. Mm-hmm. But I want to talk about it because a lot of times people who are either on the fence or, you know, they feel quite clear that they either want to have kids or they don't want to have kids, as in your case, but they have a partner who has different feelings about things. So maybe just kind of top level, can you let us know, like, what was the circumstance with your ex-husband?
So when we met, he knew, like, I told him on the first day that we met that I didn't want to have kids. And, you know, I repeated that a few times, including the day before we got married. I sort of reminded him, like, hey, you know this, right? Don't marry me if you want to have kids. But he was okay with that. You know, he told me, like, oh, I'd rather be with you than have kids. What we didn't do was have like a deep conversation about it. You know, what I did was more like, oh, let me inform you of the situation, right?
Yeah.
And you either sign on or you don't. In hindsight, that was not smart. Like, I should have probed. I should have asked, how do you feel? You know, I didn't do that. And very quickly after we got married, he did start trying to convince me. And I had moved for him from Belgium to the United States. And so I was, stuck is a big word, but in a way I was, right?
Yeah.
I couldn't just up and leave. Like, I had given up too much. You know, I had quit my job and sublet my apartment and said goodbye to everyone. And, you know, like, my stuff was in my parents' basement. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't so easy to undo. And so I was disappointed, that so quickly this thing that I had told him, he was sort of writing that back. And he kept sort of hammering on it, and it became ever more pressing for him. One, because he got older, obviously, but two, I think our lives, his and mine, looked very different. Like, he works in tech, and he was working, when this really came to a head, like at the sort of peak of him trying to convince me. He was working this job that he really didn't care for, like he would show up in the morning, he would do his work and go home at night, but it wasn't fulfilling in a sort of deep soul way.
Yeah.
And I was doing a job that was fulfilling like that, like I was interviewing writers, I was making radio stories that were like deeply reported. I got to follow my curiosity. I got to be open to the world and sort of take in a lot of the richness and then filter it through, my soul and sort of put it out in a shape that people could enjoy. So it was really meaningful to me. And so when he said, like, what if you don't have a kid, what's the point of life? Like, all we do is work and then die? That was, of course, his experience. And that was, of course, not my experience. And so it really came to a head after 8 years of marriage, where he finally realized, like, oh, this is never going to happen. She's never going to change her mind. And he left.
Did you try and change your mind? Like, were you kind of like, if I can just think about this the right way, I can convince myself to feel differently? Or like, had you given him hints that maybe you would have a change of heart? Or and likewise, did he try and change his mind? Like, was he trying to create or find an openness for what a child-free life might look like for the two of you?
Not really. I think what the way it so often does, right? Like, once you have these opposing views, you start getting entrenched in your views, and it requires like a really open, brave person, I think, to stay like to be willing to change your mind for someone else, and we didn't do that. Neither of us did that. We really just got firmer and firmer in our, again, to use that word, position, And it was only once he left and once I could sort of put the weapons down, I could like drop my defenses, that everything that I had been repressing for years came, roaring up, It was just like, oh, this is how I feel. And it was a lot more complicated than I had. It's not even that I knew while we were together, like, oh, let me smush down all the nuance and my doubt. And, it wasn't like that. I really believed that there is not a cell in my body that wants to have a kid, And then he left and I realized that that was wrong. And it's not even so much that I discovered like, oh, maybe I do want to have a kid. It was more that I realized, because I had been so busy defending myself, I hadn't actually ever asked myself why. You know what I mean? Like, it almost, I think now what happened is that was probably dangerous. That I probably couldn't, in a deep way, ask myself why.
Yeah.
Because doing that would have risked doubt, like maybe I would have come out to a place where I was like, oh, maybe. And so I never did that. And then he left, and it was almost like, oh, wow, I've been thinking about this and talking about this for like nearly 2 decades. But have I ever gotten to the the core of it, the heart of it, you know? And I realized that I hadn't. And so I started almost from zero, you know, asking myself almost for the first time, because I didn't have to defend myself, what is it about me that makes it so impossible to want something that all people around me want? Because that's the funny thing also, right? Like you hear about like, oh, you know, more and more people decide not to. Where are they? I don't know. Not my friends.
We all are asking those questions. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and so I was surrounded by people who either had kids, wanted them, you know, wanted to start trying soon. And so my conclusion was there's something wrong with me. I want to figure out what it is. And it's not so much that I tried to convince, like, the goal was not trying to want to have kids, right? The goal was more like, I loved my husband so much. He loved me so much. And all of a sudden, I was alone in this foreign country without the person who was like my only family there, who made me laugh every day, you know, who made me see, like, he was really good at sort of seeing the beauty in an ordinary day, you know, if like a funny bird was like, you know, sitting on a branch near our window, like, oh, he would stand there, look at it and like call me over and be like, oh my God, look at that little funny yellow on his head. And, you know, there was just something like he made my days so much better. And all of a sudden he was gone over this decision that I realized I hadn't really interrogated even.
Yeah.
Was that really worth it? And I became sort of angry in a new way with myself, you know, like I could sort of see the magnitude of the sacrifice. Like, oh, this decision of mine has cost me a lot.
Yeah.
Was it really worth it? And so that's kind of that's why I started the podcast.
Yeah. I'm interested, of course, to hear a bit of what you found out. You know, what is wrong with you, right?
Yeah.
Wink, wink. For those listening to the audio. However, I just want to. I'll call you in, Helena. You say not a cell in my body wanted to have kids. And yet in the podcasts, we hear about some different experiences, which I won't detail, we'll get people to listen, but where actually it seems like part of you does want to have this experience. And there's parts of motherhood that you do feel compelled by, you know, whether it's small or larger degrees. So
yeah,
when you say, you know, I didn't really want this, what do you attribute that? Like, was there any pull there then? Or is this sort of artistic license where we, for a good story?
No. There's no artistic I mean, you know, like it's so double, right? And I think that's where the complexity comes from. It's like you cannot want a kid and also be aware of everything you're missing out on and be really pained by that, you know, and really not know even like, how do you mourn that or how do you reckon with that? You know, because you know that the sacrifice is, I don't know, I don't want to speak in absolutes, right? Like maybe this is not how other people feel, but I definitely felt like, I think the biggest pull for me was sort of the promise of transformation.
I was going to say the possibility. Yeah, yes. I feel that.
You know, like I think parents have to learn so many things. You know, they have to question. I mean, look, good parents, right? There are people who don't do that. But, you know, if you really like mean well as a parent and you do that job, you know, with integrity, I think you just transform. It's inevitable. You know, like you have to become more flexible. You have to learn to let go of expectations because your kid is not going to be and do what you planned, you know, for them. And you're going to have to get better at doing things that you don't want to do, you know, whatever, whether it's going to a PTA meeting or like anything. But there might be something there that actually is good for you. Do you know what I mean? It's like I've always thought that when you have a kid, you're forced to build community in a new way. You know, like you have to interact with the other parents and with, you know, the healthcare system in a new way, or, you know, with so many things, like so many of the the structures that make up our society. And I've always been able to shield myself a little, to keep myself apart, to choose sort of the convenience, of like, let me not get mixed up and all that. Like, it seems so boring, all these like community meetings and whatever. But ultimately, I don't think that's good for me. Ultimately, I think it entrenches sort of this, fearful, what is even the word for that? You know how, like, I don't know if you feel this way, but when I moved to America, I was shocked by sort of the convenience economy, the way that everyone gets everything delivered.
Yeah.
And it always felt to me like something important is eroded.
We're missing
there.
something.
We're missing something.
Absolutely. 100%. I think about this often, that we've convenience-fied. I've just made a new word, but like we've just made everything far too simple and easy that we are missing. And I think part of why I resonate with the podcast is I have this similar kind of like curiosity and this desire for connection. And it can be the most mundane exchange, but it can really just like shape our days. So much of that, I think, is going away or has gone away for many people. Anyways, continue. I totally agree.
And so just to sort of finish that, comparison, like I think that often connection and relationships emerge out of something that you don't choose. You have to go, in this non-convenient society, right? You have to go to the store and buy your stuff. And maybe it's the corner store and you get to know the person who owns the store. And after a while, you learn about, like what they like to do after work and, how their kids are doing and whatever. And it's beautiful, And I think for someone like me who's an introvert, unless I'm forced to interact with people, I often don't. My friends, yes. But, the people that you don't choose to interact with, like, I never have to, I work from home. I only interact with my friends. Like, I live in an apartment building in New York City. It's not like we neighbors are like, over at each other's place all the time or even saying hi. Like it doesn't really, you know what I mean? Like everyone really lives their own life. And one of the things that I thought I was missing out on was this sense of like being in society, like all of your tendrils are sort of connected. It's almost like I'm a tumbleweed. And once you have kids, you can be a tree, And it's scary too, because as a tumbleweed, you can go everywhere. And as a tree, you can't, But there's also something beautiful about that rootedness, And I thought it could be good for me to be a little more forced. It sounds horrible, but, forced to get out of my comfort zone. I think that's really what it is about, like my comfort zone can get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's isolating, And so that was definitely one of the things that I thought maybe I should just jump. Maybe I should just have a kid and not think about it too deeply. I mean, that's what we've done throughout history, right? We didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
Just do it and then live with that new reality and you'll discover a new side of yourself. And I didn't have like any illusions that it would be easy, right? Like I know that we usually only grow through like a situation that sucks,
Yes,
like someone
absolutely.
close to us
Sadly,
dies,
this is true.
right? Or you lose your job, or like there's a war. I mean, like awful things happen, and then we have to step up and grow.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe that is what it is. I don't want to have a kid, but maybe what I want is not always so healthy.
There's so many, I mean, we could have like whole other conversations about this, because I do think I see this as a potential, I don't want to say like a pitfall of the child-free choice, but I do think there's a real emphasis around ease and freedom and having all the things you want. And like, listen, I'm about those things. I've like designed and built my life around that, but I also wonder like at what cost. And I know, for example, when you speak with, one of the sort of guests, your gentleman you interview, Sam, he talks about just like the hardship and the difficulty and period of regret that he has in his fatherhood experience. And yet it's sort of like the forging that happens through that ultimately, like that, and I know you talk about this in the podcast, like that often is where the meaning comes from. That's where the fulfillment, that's where the joy. And I think, where we have to be careful is knowing that, like, being a parent is not the only way those transformations and changes can happen, but we have to take more responsibility for enacting them and putting ourselves into difficult situations by force and choice, which most people don't want to say, like, hey, sign me up for something that feels scary or different or outside my comfort zone. It's like we're on this conveyor belt, if you will, when we jump into parenthood of, like, you're naturally going to go through all the shit. And that's good or bad. So anyways, I'm curious your thoughts on that, or if that sort of echoes how you're feeling.
I mean, it's exactly like what you say. And when you don't have kids, you have to come up with your own, to put it in a stupid sort of video game parlance or whatever, like challenges, You have to come up almost with like little quests, oh, how can I do something that scares me?
Yeah.
And we're naturally disinclined to do that, right? For obvious reasons. Who wakes up and is like, I mean, some people do that, but not me. And I think you're absolutely right that sort of I don't want to say propaganda because that sounds really negative, but I do think that sort of the way that people who don't have kids, by choice, and I don't know if you've noticed, but like I keep not using the word child-free. I don't like that word. And again, if other people feel like that word really is good for them, fabulous, power to you. But to me, it's too self-congratulatory and a little insulting to people who do have kids. Child-free is like pest-free, or, the stuff that you see on your shampoo, like sulfate-free or whatever, like it doesn't have the bad thing that you don't want. It's like kids are not a bad thing, like they are just humans, just little ones, and this idea of like child-free as all about free and freedom, I think is actually, I think it's dangerous to talk about that. Because if you expect freedom, I think you're going to be disappointed. Like I can't remember who said that, but someone quoted someone, and it's only my friend who I remember. I don't remember the actual person who wrote the quote. Someone said, freedom is the freedom to choose your own chains. And I think it's true. I think none of us are free in the sense of unencumbered, no responsibilities. I mean, or you have to be a total psychopath or sociopath, You
don't want to be, really.
No.
Like, at least I don't. People think they do, but we need to question that. Yeah.
I think so. And I think that there is a beauty to recognizing or to making ourselves dependent on each other, indebted to each other, responsible for each other, to just not, isn't that what being politically engaged is about? To not close your eyes for like your neighbors who are, afraid to go out, to go buy groceries or go to work or to school because ICE might pick them up and deport the mom or the dad, If you don't want any responsibility, if you're like, I am free and footloose or whatever the expression is, then you're also turning your back to the suffering of others, and I just don't think that is a way to live ultimately, that is a meaningful way to live.
So I'm interested with sort of, this process of discovery and uncovering your true feelings on this. And maybe, first of all, I'll get you to just share, like, I know we can't distill it down to like 3 hot tips on how to listen to yourself, but like, was there anything in particular that let you better cut through all the noise, if you will, or like the different sort of crowding factors to help you get clear on like, yes, this is in fact what I want?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like with a decision as nuanced and as, changeable or elusive, right? As like, should I, do I want to have a kid or not? I think it's rare that you can be like, in this moment, I realized, but it
I
might,
totally agree.
right?
Yeah, no, I'm always like, if you've had this experience, all the power to you. But the light bulb moment is one that I hear about almost never.
Yes.
Almost zero times have I heard about this. So
I had a light bulb
moment.
moment.
Did
Yes.
you? Okay, tell us.
Yes.
This
and
is
of
amazing.
Course, maybe it's one of those light bulb moments that was just like, the last drop that I needed to come to this conclusion or whatever, right? Like maybe I needed to do all this work to get there. I think so. But the light bulb moment was when I was talking to Sam, who you just mentioned, this man who I didn't know very well. We're friends now, but like we met through work. We'd met once. He regretted having kids. And he was just one of those, like not the kind of person that I would usually take advice from. Sort of a bro-y, macho, fuck is every third word, like.
He's a character, I'll say that.
Yes, he's sort of very larger than life character, But he had a way of saying it as it is, like he wasn't mincing words. He was not going to try and protect my feelings.
No.
He wasn't just like sitting there being like, yeah, I understand. Tell me more. No, he was really going out there and sort of making big statements. But the thing that he said that really was like the sun breaking through the clouds for me was, you will be disappointed either way. And that's like a very dark thing to say. It's like, that was the sun breaking through the clouds.
I love it. I get why it's the sun, but tell us more. Yeah, because I agree. That can seem like, wow, great. Life's going to be terrible no matter what.
Yes, but it was sort of an acknowledgement of, like he really said that, like, there will be regret either way. And there was something so liberating about that, because what I had been doing was I had been looking for certainty. I had been looking for a place where I wouldn't feel doubt anymore, where I wouldn't wonder anymore. What if? Am I missing out? Where I wouldn't feel that pain of like, when I see my friend with her little baby son and, my friend is so happy when like he's turned around on his own for the first time. Like, you know what I mean? It's nothing spectacular, but like the joy on her face and sort of the pride, like he turned onto his belly all by himself. Like, I don't know, the way that kids, I think the thing that hurts me the most, or that most reliably makes me feel sort of this squeeze in my heart, like I want that, is when you hear kids figure out language, when they're like coming up with their own little grammar rules, and they're wrong, but they're also not wrong. You're like, oh, I get the logic, And I think it's so beautiful to sort of see their hungry, creative minds at work, trying to figure out the world and trying to express themselves and coming up with words to sort of, get to an experience that maybe we don't think about. Like I was talking to someone earlier a few days ago, and she said that, her daughter said, what does this descent mean? And before the mother could explain, the daughter was like, because I thought that it meant going down the stairs, like descending like that, But here they're talking about family. And so the mom was like realizing that it is quite arbitrary, like, like your descendants or whatever. Why are we going down? You can just as well say that you're going up in the tree or in the whatever. A tree, again, is another metaphor. So it's just like, that makes me so, like, it fills me with longing. And I used to think that's a sign. This little pain in my heart, this pinch, this longing, this feeling of regret, like I will never have that. That must be a sign that I'm wrong, that I'm making a mistake. I should go back to the drawing board. I should, go through it again, for the millionth time. Are you really sure?
Please don't.
As if like the millionth time is going to do it,
Yeah.
And the fact that he said there will be regret either way. You will be disappointed either way. It was so liberating because it allowed me to just see doubt for what it is. It doesn't have to be this earth-shattering, foundation-shaking, back to the drawing board event. It can just be a moment that you feel some pain.
Yeah.
And then you feel it and you sit with that and you allow yourself to feel the longing and the maybe the feeling of emptiness, maybe, like all of that. And then you move through that, as we always do with emotions. And then you can just go back to your life and enjoy the things that you do have. And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That changed everything.
It's funny because right now, what I just pulled up on my phone this was a citation from your podcast. Helena says, what if it was not a sign and just a feeling that I could have and then let go? Which is exactly what you just said. And I will say, for myself, the biggest thing that has allowed me to feel more confident in this child-free choice, which, I think we feel we either have an innate knowing or we come to that decision, but it's like, how do we solidify that? Because it's not black and white, like, okay, now there's a child and therefore I'm a parent, so I've got to somehow come into this new identity. The difference maker was that these difficult emotions, if you will, these feelings that we don't want to feel, the wistfulness, the uncertainty, the doubt, I stopped making meaning of it. Like, it doesn't have to mean anything, or it means that's something I would have liked, or that would be really nice, or that's very beautiful, but not making the meaning of, therefore I've made the wrong choice.
Yes.
Therefore, like you say, I need to go back to the drawing board. And it's just so reaffirming to hear that echoed in your own experience. And I think when we can stop doing that, and like this applies to so many other things in life, right? If we can just be with what is, we don't want to be with it when it feels bad, whether that's grief or heartbreak or, the discomfort of everything horrible that's happening in the world. But it's like, if we can be with those emotions and allow them to move through us, there's sometimes circumstances where we do want to act, of course, and try and change course. But a lot of times we just have to let things sort of lie and be.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're right. It is like that with a lot of things. Like, I left my home country. You did too.
Yeah.
Right? To come to this new country where your family isn't. And when, I was home in Belgium in November, and I was staying with my sister. She's, my little sister, she's 3 years younger, which is, she's a grown adult, right? But to me, she'll always be my little sister. And she was going through a really rough time. Like, something had happened in her life that is just a level of awful that, I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. And I had to, after 2 weeks, I had to get on a plane and go back to New York. And it felt so awful. I was really thinking, like, what am I doing with my life? Sure, like my friends and my job and, my new love, they're all in New York, but like, really? I'm going to abandon my sister? Because sure, you can talk on the phone, but it's not the same. And she's so sad that she often cannot talk. And so a lot of me being there, we didn't talk. We just sat with each other and I held her as she cried. And we just drank tea together. Like, you can't do that over the phone. And so that is one of those things that makes me wonder, should I change course? Should I go back? Did I make a mistake? And maybe one day I will, right? Like, maybe that sort of weighing, that balance will come out the other end, But it's like you say, this feel like you have one life, and you can't do all the things. That's another thing that Sam said, like, that's a logistical, infrastructural problem with life, like, you live it once, but you can always question it. And I think that's so valuable to realize, like, the number of times that you can ask yourself, did I make a mistake, is infinite. And your life is only one, you know? So I think it's that too, that we just have to realize, like, we will never square that circle. It can't be, you know? And so just to live in that discomfort, which again, you know, not fun, you know?
No, not at all. Yeah. Well, and I like what you said, you know, maybe someday I will, i.e. go back to Belgium, but
Yeah.
it's similar, by the way, for those of you who listening who are, you know, who don't feel clear at all, who haven't come close to one decision or another, like, yeah, with being in the discomfort of this indecision, like one day you will either decide to have a child or remain indefinitely child free. Like, but we don't need to have that immediacy of like, I need to make sense of it right now. And I get why we want to like translate all of our feelings into something that makes sense. But I do think over time we start to see trends. And I know for myself, like as much as, yeah, I have those wistful moments and what would life be like in that parallel universe and whatnot, over time, there's, you know, it's kind of, my financial advisors, like the stock market, you know, ups and downs, but over time it always goes up. It's like, I think overall I feel good about this child-free life and I have more confidence and I embody it more. And also there will be plummets just like the stock market, right? And I think it's knowing when we're in those moments that like we will be okay. We can come back up again, but we just kind of need to be in the shit while we're in it.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I have one last thing, if I may. Do we have time for me to ask you one more question?
Absolutely.
Or thereabouts? Okay, so something I want to talk about is this question of like meaning and purpose, because it's a really big one that comes up around this decision. And it creates a lot of pressure, especially for those who are choosing not to have kids or considering that path. Because just like we talked about how there's sort of like, that's inbuilt a little bit, one might say, or that possibility more easily resides on the path of having kids. What I hear from people choosing the child-free path is like, okay, what the hell else am I supposed to do with my life? What is going to bring my life meaning? I'm going to have to figure out those challenges, those quests, those projects as I think of them. How have you thought about that? And do you have any sort of insights you can offer us on that topic?
The one thing that I've learned from making this show, right, is that I'm a little bit wrong about myself in so many ways.
Yeah,
you know?
I would agree with you, actually. Tell me more.
Yeah, like, you know, the way the show is structured is, yes, I tell the story of, you know, my life and my sort of inner turmoil around this. But I also talk to people who know me really well, you know, my best friends, my partner, my sister, my mom. And I hear about their life and their decisions, but they also reflect on me, on how they see me, you know? And it was through those conversations that I realized that I'm not the most reliable narrator of my own story. And one of those things that I wasn't reliable about was this feeling of meaning, you know? And it just took other people to point out all the things that I was already doing that, like, the part that really has stayed with me the most is my friend Joshua, right, who has kids and or has a kid and who was always trying to convince me to have a kid also, and who would say really like, it is just the love that you feel for your kid is like nothing else, you know? And at the end of our conversation, he comes to this point where he's like, I am not going to try to convince me anymore. I've realized, I've come to a point where I agree with you. I think I don't think it's everyone's purpose to have kids. And I think you're one of those people. And so I ask him the natural follow-up question. So what do you think is my purpose, you know? And his first reaction was to burst out laughing, which I thought, hey, this is a serious question. You know, I'm not just asking for the show or for, you know what I mean? I really have this deep anxiety that I am not doing it correctly, you know? And he said, well, I think everyone's purpose, you know, is to see the sublime. He's religious, he's Orthodox Jewish, and so that's kind of the frame through which he sees that. But he said, I think everyone's purpose is to notice the sublime in everyday life. Sure, in a flower, in a beautiful sunny day, but also in like a plastic bag that is sort of floating around the parking lot. And he said, but for you specifically, I think your purpose is to see the divine or to see the sublime in people. Did he say sublime or divine? I can't remember now.
I think he said sublime. But I'm feeling it today, right now, by the way. Like it.
Yeah.
This exists in so many moments that continue. Yeah, regardless of what you believe, by the way, for listeners. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, I also like that he said it in a sort of non-dogmatic, he wasn't talking about God, it was just like, no matter your belief, even if you're an atheist, we all know what that feeling of the sublime, that feeling of like awe at the richness of life, at, how unexpected it is, at the way it can sort of cut off our breath almost, because you're so grateful that you get to experience this, that you get to be alive in a body that can feel things, And so he said, I think our purpose is to see the sublime in everyday life. And your purpose in particular is to see the sublime in people. The way that you open yourself up to people when you interview someone, for instance, like you open yourself up, and just the curiosity that you have, the tenderness, the sort of the generosity, because I think that's what you do too, right? Like listening is such an act of generosity. And I'm always surprised at like how much people tell me, they haven't met me before.
Shocking.
Shocking, right?
It's a gift. It's an honor, but it's really, I mean, honestly, for folks listening, like people will tell you all kinds of things if you just listen and ask thoughtful questions.
Yes. And I think one of the reasons is because it happens so rarely. I think of any dinner party that you went to recently. Were you asked thoughtful questions? Or is everyone just waiting their turn?
Half the time you're not asked questions, period. Like it's
none.
My husband and I often remark, we're like, people just seemingly are so, I don't know if incurious is a word, but like it's so lacking. It's crazy. I agree.
And I think people are just in general, like waiting their turn to say their thing, know? And already thinking about, instead of listening what someone else is saying, they're already formulating the thought that will come next or whatever, And so I think that for me, like the way that I see the sublime every day is in keeping sort of that generosity going, in keeping living from a place of, I care about you, I want to know about you, you are important, like I think we can give that to each other to really see, because in the beginning, right, I said like, oh, what is my story? Dime a dozen. But like no one's story is a dime a dozen, literally no one, right? Like all of us are unique and complex and, rich in ways that, and some people, of course, do their darnest to, I mean, there are some political figures here, at the helm here in the United States that, are they complex and rich and, rich in this other sense. But like somewhere deep down, there must be like a little child that wants love, right? And that has just been destroyed by life or whatever. And now they're acting that out, But I really believe that there can be tremendous meaning in being an open observer and appreciator of the world that is, without feeling like you have to add, you know what I mean? Like even if you don't have a kid, even if you don't make art, like even if you don't add in that sense, to the world that is, you are adding with your attention, with your love, with your, curiosity and the connections that only you can make. My editor was like, you go on and on about like, yeah, kids are magic, but so are we, right? Like we were once kids. Why would that have disappeared? Like every single one of us is magic. And I think if you think about that, like those wild odds, right? Like that I exist. And if my parents had, conceived me even a second later, it wouldn't be me. It would be another kid, And so the fact that we are here at all, I really feel that no matter what else you do with your life, if you are aware of that in a deep way and try to live from that, wow, I get to live, I think you're living in meaning.
My cup runneth over.
Thank you, Keltie. This is conversation. So lovely.
I was going to say this has been so beautiful. I certainly could talk to you for hours, but I think we will wrap things up right here. Tell us, where can we find the Creation Myth podcast? Where can we find you and learn more about the work that you're doing and all your various forums?
Yeah, so you can find the podcast. If you Google Creation Myth, you're maybe not going to find it. It lives on the CBC podcast personally. So it's like a podcast that has memoirs on it. So mine is the last one. If you open it, that's the one you'll see personally.
We'll put it in the show notes too.
Great.
So it's right there linked. Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Is there anything else you're working on that we can expect to listen to, read, hear about?
Well, I've been making an interview podcast for the Poetry Foundation called Poetry Off the Shelf. And I think a lot of people don't listen because they're like, poetry, I don't know. But the way I see it is like, poets are special people, because they have chosen no money and no fame, right? Poetry will not get you to either of those things. So they are, I think, special in that they have listened to some little voice inside them that, the rest of society doesn't really think you should follow, and they do it anyway. And so they often feel deeply, think deeply. And people write poetry about all kinds of things, right? Like grief and, their abortion and maybe the war in their country, like all kinds of things. And so I talk with those people about that. And then we read a little poem, but it's really not the point of the conversation. So, if you want to sort of get more in my world, I think maybe that's a good place to start. Can I share one episode with you that you maybe can link to that I think
absolutely.
is really beautiful?
And I was going to say, I mean, you've got me sold. I'm going to listen. First of all, I do consume a little poetry here and there. Generally on the weekend with my morning coffee. It makes me feel very fancy.
Yeah, totally.
Before I go hiking, I'm like, let's read a poem by Mary Oliver about going into the woods or whatever.
Oh, I'll share that too, the Mary Oliver book. Yeah.
That would be
great.
So
my voice isn't in there. That. So the Mary Oliver thing, it's sort of annoying because like, I did the whole bloody thing. So they asked me, they were like, can you make a thing about Mary Oliver? I was like, great. What do you want me to do? They're like, just figure it out. So I did everything, came up with the concept, found the guests, interviewed them, edited it all together, added the music, wrote the narration. But then because someone else, they hired like an actor to read the narration, no one knows that I had anything to do with it. It's so frustrating. But anyway, I will send it to you.
Well, now all the listeners of the Kids Are Child-Free podcast know. A drop in a bucket, but yeah. No, please do send that. And send an episode of the Poetry Off the Shelf.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for wanting to showcase that. And Keltie, your questions are so, I mean, the way you listen to my podcast, really letting it sort of enter your heart. I'm so grateful to you, truly.
Honestly, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. And I've got to say, I'm somebody, so I'm like immensely expressive if you meet me, see me, etc. But whenever I consume, books, TV shows, etc., I rarely laugh at funny movies. My husband will be sitting beside me crying, reading the same book I read. I'm like, yeah, it was really sad. But I got to say, when I was listening to this podcast, like I wish somebody could have just followed me listening, because I had all these moments like when I won't give a spoiler, but when Brendan comes to the door, as soon as you say the sound engineer rang the doorbell, I'm literally making dinner and I'm like, oh my God, like, because I knew what was going to happen next. And God, there was something else yesterday. I can't remember. I'll have to try and remember and tell you afterwards what it was. But I just I had to laugh out loud because I just identified so much. So I was a very expressive, engaged listener with the podcast, and I just thoroughly enjoyed it. I've got a whole bunch of my clients right now in my group program who are listening, and we're dialoguing about it. I told them that we're going to be talking to you and hearing from you today. So I know it's going to be so much appreciated, this additional conversation we've had, and everyone must go back if they have not already and listen to The Creation Myth on CBC personally.
Thank you, Keltie.
Don't go just yet. I have one more thing I want to share with you today, and that is an ask. If you are enjoying the podcast and you have not already left us a rating and a review on your favorite podcast app, you can give us a star rating on the Spotify app. If you listen in the Apple Podcast app, you can leave a rating as well as a review, i.e. share a few kind words about this podcast and how it's impacted you. This goes a really long way in helping our podcast get discovered by other listeners, prospective, or I should say fence sitters who need some help with their decision. It'll just take you a quick moment, and it truly does go a long way. So again, rating, review, make sure as well that you're subscribed to the podcast so you always get future episode updates. And otherwise, I wish you a beautiful rest of your day.